Hello everyone. Today I continue talking about the integration solution. Those who didn't see my previous videos about development of the integration solution with use of Azure Integration Services, please find the link to the playlist with those videos down below in the description to this video. Today I'm going to talk about deployment of this solution. And it will be another series of videos focused on Azure DevOps, automation of deployments, pipelines, Bicep files with definition of Azure resources, and how we will develop such a project. It will be a project, and how this project will work to deploy the resources into our Azure tenant. Let's get started. First of all, let's start with the Git tool, the software, which has to be installed on your computer in order to work with Git repositories. In Azure DevOps, we will use the Git repository. And first of all, I have it deployed, but please go to download page of Git and download the appropriate version of this software to your computer. After it's done, I go to the Azure DevOps portal. Here you can choose the button Start Free. I have my organization already created. This is the organization name in the URL. But those who create it for first time, you will get open the page with filling out details of your new organization. After the organization is created, you have to create a project. And the project will be used for storing the code repositories and everything around development of your code, of your project. So I will have to give some name. It will be demo project. And for a free account, it's only private. As you see, the project is created, and then on the left-hand side, there are a number of menu items. We will go first to the repositories. It is an empty repository now, and here is the list of repositories. Here you can create multiple code repositories as you wish. You can split your big project to several repositories, or you can store several projects in one DevOps project composed logically together. But I will go further with this code repo. And first of all, I have to create a copy of the code repository in DevOps on my local computer. I copy this URL. And then I will switch to the Visual Studio Code as my favorite development tool. I will switch first to the folder, which I will use for my code. It's development. So here in the terminal, we will use the Git tool. The command to run is git clone, and I paste the URL taken into clipboard from the DevOps site. Run it. As you see here, the folder is created on my local computer. The git clone command has linked my local folder with the code repository. Now to the solution. This project will contain Bicep files with definition of Azure resources, which compose the solution I discussed earlier. So I usually do it like a separate folder per Azure resource type. For instance, logic apps folder will contain all files working to create logic apps in the Azure. The solution which I presented earlier contains also API operations hosted by API Management Service. So I will have API Management folder. But today I will start with creation only of a logic app and will show how this will be shaped to create a deployment solution. And let's switch to the Azure tenant. And I will go to the resource group with Azure resources created earlier for the integration solution. When we open any Azure resource details in the Azure portal, there is an export template option in automation section. So when we have this selected, the window in the center will display ARM template for the corresponding resource. ARM template is the Azure Resource Manager template. I will not use in my solution the ARM templates, but I rather prefer using Bicep files. But we can use this ARM template as a source for generation of the Bicep file. I copy the ARM template from the screen and then I switch to Visual Studio Code, and here I will create a file. I will give a name resource JSON, which I will use for containing the ARM template for my logic app. In order to work with Bicep files, you need to have Azure CLI installed, and the Bicep is part of the Azure CLI of version 220 or later. So you have to start with installation of Azure CLI if you still don't have it installed. Azure CLI installer can be obtained from the Microsoft site. You just download the installation file. After the Azure CLI has been installed, you should check whether you have Bicep available to you. In order to do that, we run the command easy Bicep version. I've got an error, which means that I have to install Bicep support in the Azure CLI. So I install Bicep. It's done now. And with Bicep, I'm going to get a Bicep representation of the ARM template, which I have taken from the Azure portal. With Azure Bicep command, I'm going to convert a resource JSON file containing ARM template of the logic app resource into Bicep file. So I'm going to use az bicep decompile command with file parameter, where the file is gonna be my resource JSON file, and I run this command, and this is indication of the successful execution. There are no red errors. And I will find the Bicep file created by this command in the same folder. If I switch to the Bicep file, it contains the definition of the logic app resource. But one thing I miss here in Azure Studio Code, which will help to better read the Bicep code. This is an extension which serves to work with Bicep files. I'm going to install this. And now you see the text has got coloring and IntelliSense. So let's have a look at the Bicep file. Along with the parameters, it uses two parameters, one for the logic app name, another one for the Cosmos DB external ID. I will tell a bit more about it later. There is a resource. This resource is the Microsoft Logic workflow, which is used, this type is used for definition of logic apps. Here we have a name, location, enabled system assigned identity. In the properties section, we will find three main sections: triggers, actions, and parameters. This logic app reflects the actual logic app which saves a customer into a Cosmos DB database. I switch back to the Azure portal and I will show what we have in the logic app. Those who saw my previous videos remember that this logic app was used to send data to the Cosmos DB database. It has the HTTP trigger with the schema definition, then an action to compose document which will be sent to Cosmos DB, and the action for saving data to Cosmos DB database. I'm going to do it in a simple way on the first demo. I'm going to remove these two actions and it will contain only HTTP trigger just for simplicity. I will show the full version sometime later when I will add creation of the Cosmos DB database. Then we will be able to use the action working against the Cosmos DB. So I switch back to the Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do here, we see two actions in the action section that I will remove all the content from here. If I open the trigger, we see that the trigger contains a JSON schema definition. I will not touch this. The connection is the one used to get connected to the Cosmos DB. And here I can also remove everything. So you see that the code highlights this parameter that is declared but never used. So I can remove it from here. The logic app name, I prefer to change the logic app name and the name of the parameter itself. I can do it with pressing F2 button and type in the new name. As a result, both the parameter in the definition part and the parameter where it's used, both will be changed. This one and this one. And the name, I will change the logic app name to 010, for instance. Doesn't make a big difference, but I'm going to show how the deployment of the logic app works with use of Azure DevOps pipeline. One more thing. It's desirable to change the location assignment method. For this, I can use a param named location. The name can be whatever. but I define the data type as a string, and I can assign a default value right now here in the parameter definition. And the value will be taken from the resource group location attribute. Resource group is a function in Bicep which returns the current resource group object. And location is the value which I can use here. Here it's a parameter value. So I have a very simplified logic app which I have to copy to my logic app folder. This is just a working file which I use to convert ARM template code into Bicep code, and these two files will be used for conversion of any resource which I will include in my solution. So I make a copy with drag and drop, and here I will change the name to Logic App, for instance, or Logic Apps, because it will contain at least one more Logic App in the end, in the next session. The next step is in the setting up the project is creation of the release pipeline YAML file. I will give a name release pipeline YML. This file will contain several sections. First, trigger none, which means that we will not use any trigger for automating running of the release pipeline. By the way, automation can be of different types. It can be commit to the code repository, where we can choose also which branch commit we will use. It may be also scheduled, or it may be done automatically once a day at a particular time, in case there were any changes in the code repository. But I choose none, which means that I will run the pipeline manually. The pool virtual machine image in the pool is Windows latest, so that the latest operating system will be chosen. Then there will be a section of variables, and here I will define a few variables. I prefer defining a variable artifact name, and here I give a name to the artifact which will be created by the release pipeline during deployment. The point is that the code repository is taken and saved in a folder of the virtual machine agent chosen for deployment from code repository into the local file system of the server which runs the deployment. And we can give a name to this artifact. And since the name of the artifact is used at least in two places, I give it a name. Here I choose Logic Apps. I will show you what it looks like while the deployment runs. I'm going to also use a variable which will contain the Logic App name. And the variable will be named as Logic App name with value. The value I can copy from the Bicep file where I have given it. This is the default value, which is used if the parameter does not get a value, but I will define this so that I have control over values given to the names of the resources I create. I need also to give a name to the resource group. So I usually use the variable named target resource group name. And the name will be RG CMS deployment. That's enough. And then next are stages section. I will paste the code defining the stage of publishing the repository. So the meaning of this stage and jobs within it is the publishing of the artifact with use of copy files command. It takes the code repository from the source directory and puts the code repository content into the artifact staging directory on the agent machine. And then this artifact is published with the name. So artifact name defined here, a variable for the artifact name is used here to give a name to the artifact. These fields prefixed by build are inbuilt variables, standard variables, which specify standard predefined directories in the file system of the server. The result of this is the published code repository content, which becomes available for the deployment tasks, which we will see defined further. So I define the second stage, and it will be deployment stage. Deployment to, let's say, it is a deployment to development environment. I use dev. And it depends on the stage called publishing artifacts. Then we can define variables for this particular stage. Here it makes sense to define the variables group. The variables group is a group of variables defined in the Azure DevOps which are available to the release pipeline or the deployment pipeline, where we can define the variables, and usually we define variables per environment. So for instance, if this is a stage of deploying to the dev environment, here it makes sense to use the variables group with values actual for the development environment. Let's have a look how it's done. In the Azure DevOps portal, we will go to pipelines, and the library is used to define the variable groups. So I will give it a name of demo deployment dev. And yeah, it doesn't allow to save it without variables. I have to create at least one variable. It will be some dummy. I just need a variable group name to use it in the YAML file. So here, the variable group, I put the variable group name, and then I put a deployment job, which I will use to deploy the logic app. I have a template for it. Let's correct the code with intention. Intention is very important in YAML files. If you make a fail here, it will become invalid. So I have a deployment job, deployment to, well, let's define a variable which will contain the name for the environment, which we're going to use environment dev with value dev. And then here we can use the variable. This is a syntax which is used in the YAML files to take a value of a parameter or a variable. So here I will also take the variable like this and deployment to the environment dev. Here I have to specify the environment. Then with use of command Azure Resource Manager template deployment, I will deploy resources defined in the template file. In my case, it's Bicep file. The deployment name is just text which identifies the deployment. The scope, Azure Resource Manager connection. Here I have to go back to the Azure DevOps and show you what we need to do back in DevOps. In the project settings, I have to find service connections. And here I will define the connection to the Azure tenant. I click Create Service Connection button. Here I will choose Azure Resource Manager. Next, Service Principal Automatic is a recommended choice. Then the dialog proposes selection of a subscription. I have only one. You may have several subscriptions available from one template or from all the templates you have access to. So be careful choosing the right subscription here. Resource group is not selected in my connection. Service connection name. I will give a name demo tenant. Grant access permission to all pipelines by default. And the connection is created. So I can use in my release pipeline file the connection name. And once the connection is created, I have to do one thing more. I go to the library under pipelines, and I'm gonna add to the variable group demo deployment dev. Instead of this dummy variable, I will add the subscription ID. I will give a name Azure subscription ID, and you can get a subscription in the Azure portal by opening the subscription details or the list of subscriptions. And the subscription ID is this identifier, which I will put as a value for this variable. Another variable is the connection to the tenant, which I have just created. I will save it with the name Azure Tenant Connection name. I put the name in here and save it. It is, of course, a question of design which variables you will store in the variable group and which will be saved outside of the variable group in the release pipeline file, for instance. Some of these variables are constant across the deployments. Other variables are unique per environment. So here the developer has to design the solution properly. If we store these variables in the variable group, this means that we can use other tenants, other connections while deploying to other environments. Let's go further. And then I switch to the Visual Studio Code and to my release pipeline file, where I'm going to use these variables. So the first one is Azure Resource Manager connection, and here I have to put the variable Azure Tenant connection name. The value will be taken from the variable group. I remind that the variable group name was specified in here. The second variable is the subscription ID, and the variable name was Azure Subscription ID. Okay. Action is a definition of the operation which will be carried out. The resource group name, I have defined the resource group name in the variables in this file. Target resource group name. So I will use the local syntax. Variables, variable name, location. Again, I have a variable here. Variables. Template location is linked artifact. And in the CMS file parameter, I have to define the path to the Bicep file. The path to the template file is a bit tricky, but we will get it like this. It will be located in the work folder, which is a standard, one of the standard paths. Work folder, then folder 1, and then the artifact name. Why the artifact name? Because it was published with this artifact name. And this is what I meant when I said that I define the artifact name variable, because it's used at least in two places, in the publishing and then in the fetching of these files during deployment. The last section is a definition of parameters, and these are parameters used in the Bicep file. So when we go to the logic app Bicep file, these two parameters are those which can be or should be used in the release pipeline. Well, if they have a default value defined, specified, then they are optional. But if you want to have the full control over values which are assigned to the variables, it's better to specify them here. So I use it like this. I have two parameters, and that's why I have defined the logic app name here. And I put this variable in here, logic app name, and the same for location. Location. That's it. Our deployment task is ready to go. And I go to the source control section where I will commit my changes. My changes are 3 files created, but as I said earlier, these 2 files are just technical files, which I don't need in my solution. So I click plus sign here to include the logic app Bicep file, and then I give a comment, something like this. I click commit, and don't forget to push changes to the DevOps code repository. I can close this, and when I switch to the DevOps portal, we will find, yes, we will find this file uploaded to the code repository. Sorry, I've made a mistake, and I can see that the release pipeline file was not published. So I go back to the Visual Studio, and yeah, I can see that release pipeline is outside the demo project folder. So I move it into this folder and then run commit. Again, only this file. Push. Switch back to DevOps. Refresh. Yeah, the file is here. So the next step is to create a pipeline. We go here into the pipelines. I click on create pipeline. Here I choose Azure Repository Git. I give me an option to choose one. So if I have multiple code repositories, all they will be shown here. Then I choose existing Azure pipeline YAML file. And I don't need to choose another branch. It's master branch where I work now. And from path, it gives me a possibility to choose the pipeline YAML file. I click create. This file is displayed here. And then I will just save it. The file is shown then as a release pipeline with a project name. And when I click it, I then can run the pipeline. But first of all, I'm going to check if there are any errors. And it shows me that while parsing the YAML file, the error is found, and the error is about this name of connection name, which is not visible. And it's not visible because the release pipeline needs access to the variables group. So I move it away. Then I have to click on edit and then on triggers. And then here I will go to variables, variable groups. And here is the button link variable group. So I will find my variable group shown in the list. This is the variable group which I have earlier defined here under library. I will show it safe first. Demo deployment dev. 2 is number of variables in the variable group, and we will find it here in the library. I go back to the release pipeline, run. If I choose stages now, it's shown without errors. These are stages. The 2 stages are publishing artifacts. The second one is deployment to the dev environment. I use selected stages. And by the way, if there are more stages here, like for instance deployment to other environments, which may be testing environment, production environment, staging environment, whatever, you can specify which ones to use in the deployment by unchecking. Use selected, run, and the process is started. And I immediately have got an error which says no hosted parallelism has been purchased or granted. To request a free parallelism grant, please fill out the following form, and the URL is given to the form. This is a typical error, or pretty standard error for a fresh environment when you run your first pipeline. And I will go to the error details to copy this URL, and I'm gonna open the URL in here, and this is about requesting access to the parallelism by the DevOps of my organization, of my project. Please consider that it could take 2 or 3 business days to proceed the request. I give my name here, my email address, what is the name of your Azure DevOps organization. This value can be taken from this part of the URL. It's private, and then I submit. Your response was submitted. I had to wait 1 day, and the next day I'm trying to run the pipeline again. And it started working, as we see here. The publishing stage is finished. Then the deployment stage is in pending status, so I have to go back, and you will find this warning here. This pipeline needs permission to access a resource before this run can continue. This is about getting access to the environment, in this case development environment. I click permit. The permission is given. And it started running. Failed. So this deployment will be partly a troubleshooting guide as well. The error message says template file pattern matches a directory instead of a file, and it shows the path on the deployment agent on the DevOps server. This part, logic apps, is an artifact name. We will find it if we go back in here. Published, one published. This is an artifact, and the artifact is saved with the name logic apps, and it contains, in zip file, it contains the folders and files of my solution. So the folder here is logic apps as well, and logic apps bicep file. So I have to make correction in my deployment code. I switch to the Visual Studio. I will show that the error is in the Azure Resource Deployment task, the one which deploys the logic app. And I can see that the error is in the CMS file path, which ends at the artifact name, but it should continue, and it should include the Bicep file as well. I'll take the relative path and we'll add it in here like this. And then I switch to the source control view. The commit is CMS file property change. Commit. Push to the code repository. And now I switch to the DevOps portal. And I need to run the same pipeline again. So I click the button Run New. Run again. It waits for an available agent machine. And it started now. And the deployment stage. It's completed successfully. So I'm going to go to Azure and check the results of deployment. To the list of resource groups. And if you remember, I specified the target resource group as RGCMS deployment. And here it is. The logic app is created. If you remember, the logic app was created with an HTTP trigger. So it is created now, along with JSON schema included. I will switch back to the Visual Studio Code to remind what it looked like in the Bicep code. This was specified trigger, in this case HTTP trigger, with a schema, JSON schema, and it was created without any actions. This will be a topic of the next video. I will create the function in logic app with actions and with connection to the Cosmos DB database. The Cosmos DB will be created, of course, with a Bicep file as well, Bicep instructions, and we will see how the automated creation of the resources works. I'm going to develop the deployment project further and further up to the last version of the presented integration solution with all the logic apps, Azure functions, API operations, connection to Dataverse and Cosmos DB database. Please set like and subscribe to my channel if you found it interesting and useful. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments to this video. See you next time. Goodbye.